By now in our book, Thomas has moved into the cottage and he's begun the process of going through his mother's possessions to clear those out. Now, Thomas, as I mentioned, was a boy when his father was killed by a bomb, so he has this kind of unresolved trauma. And now he's lost his mother as well, who he hadn't felt particularly close to. The first few days of Thomas's week passed unremarkably. He settled into a rhythm, slowly and methodically sorting through his mother's belongings. He boxed up most of her clothes so they could be passed on to a charity shop. His sister had advised that any financial documents should be saved, but he grew tired of trying to determine which ones were important and which weren't. So he ended up throwing most of her old paperwork in the fire, where they flared brightly, briefly lighting up the room. He made steady progress, emptying cluttered drawers from the living room desk, and then a few from the kitchen, saving, for now, her silverware. The pantry was well stocked with canned goods and breakfast cereals, as well as flour and sugar. He briefly entertained the idea of learning to bake during his exile, dismissed it, and then opted to keep the food anyway, just in case. Her bedroom dresser was more trying. Several drawers held additional blouses, sweaters, and trousers, which he roughly folded and sorted into boxes. Two smaller drawers held a variety of undergarments, which he was reluctant to handle. Instead, he carried those drawers to the living room and emptied the contents into a large plastic rubbish bag. Finally, he set upon a small bookcase next to the bed, which held a few brightly colored glass figurines and a shelf of books and magazines. He set aside the glass knickknacks to be wrapped in newspaper later, and began gently tossing the books and magazines into a box when a slip of paper fell to the floor. It was a snapshot, old, black and white. He reached in and retrieved it. It was very old, but he recognized the young woman in the photo immediately. It was his mother. She was sitting side-saddled on a low stone wall or fence, looking at a young woman to her left. Thomas squinted at the photo. He didn't recognize the other woman. She had dark, wavy hair, held a cigarette in her hand, and rested her free hand on his mother's shoulder. They looked carefree. His mother's expression seemed warm and open, content. He stepped backward to the sofa and sat, still staring at the photo. It had been so very long since he had witnessed anything resembling happiness emanating from her. He realized he had been holding his breath, and he gulped, but the air caught in his throat and gurgled in a quiet wail. And suddenly he was crying, years' worth of tears running down his cheeks and spreading across the stubble on his chin. He didn't bother trying to contain it. He couldn't really. The sobs just came and came. He was lost, in grief and then in loneliness. For how long he cried, he didn't know. But when he finally was able to draw in a deep breath and look up, the day was dying and the sunlight out over the bay was receding. He set the photo on the side table and made a move to stand up, but realized there was a weight on his legs. Molly was on the couch next to him, and her head resting on his lap, her eyes upturned towards him. He hadn't noticed her jump up, indeed had never seen her on the couch at all, and his first instinct was to shoo her off, but he stopped himself and instead rested his left hand on her head. The fur was softer than he'd imagined, and he ran his hand from front to back, feeling the bony ridges under the warm, smooth coat. The fur was longer around her neck and hung over her collar. He absent-mindedly grabbed at that fur and scratched at her neck. Her tail wagged. He looked down at her face, staring back up at him. Ah, shit, girl. Orphans, huh? We're just a couple of lost dogs in Donegal. For another hour or so, they both remained on the couch. Thomas lost in memories, and Molly curled in a ball tightly against him, the warmth of her body somehow comforting. When he finally rose, Thomas carried the photo of his mother over to a short bookcase and leaned